thanks for coming tonight. As usual, because we have the freedom of speech, which is our right. No, President Bush just told us the other night, freedom of speech is a privilege now. So it's our privilege to use our freedom of speech, and we're going to make a couple announcements. One that's quite relevant. Next week on campus, on Friday, CIA is going to be doing some recruiting. So I encourage all of you that are interested in perhaps doing something about that to watch for an announcement early next week for a meeting, probably Tuesday or Wednesday, to discuss the recruiting on campus next Friday. There also will be a sign-up sheet down here. We are going to bring a CIA off-campus workshop to Missoula that's been following Mr. Agee around the country and working with him. Very active program, a very excellent program. We're going to bring that to Missoula, so if you're interested in information on that, please make sure you sign up either here down below or up in the lobby before you leave. We appreciate you all coming. We're going to use the proceeds from this event to start putting it back into our own community. And this evening's events, the proceeds are going to go to the Missoula Food Bank and the Poverello Center. So all your money is very well spent. We appreciate that. Please give yourself a round of applause for coming and doing that. After tonight's speech, we are, if people can get to the microphones, we are going to have some question and answers. We ask that, please, because of the size of the crowd, you keep it very brief and very focused. We'll have a microphone here and a microphone there, so think about what you want to ask Mr. Agee afterwards.
We'll end on with the show. From 1960 to 1969, Philip Agee worked as a CIA agent, mostly in Latin America. His work involved U.S. efforts to discredit the Cuban Revolution and to develop the anti-communist movement in Ecuador. He left the agency in 1969. By 1975, he had completed his expose book, Inside the Company's CIA Diary. It became a bestseller in Britain and has been printed in 27 languages. In 1979, his U.S. passport was revoked because our government labeled him subversive. He traveled on a Grenadian passport until the U.S. invasion there. He then traveled on a Nicaraguan passport. Just before he was scheduled to come to the U.S. for a speaking tour last fall, the Chamorro government revoked that passport. Well, now he comes to Missoula, his 35th stop of a 35-city speaking tour, carrying a Citizen of the World passport. Its authority derives from a UN declaration that says the freedom of travel is an inalienable right. And so it is our right and privilege to introduce Philip Agee.
Thank you all very much for that friendly greeting. I have an obstacle here, just a moment. Wires. You got it, didn't you? Well, it's very nice to be in Montana and Missoula. This is the last stop on this trip, and I must say it's been like this everywhere. I could not believe it from start to finish that so many people have so much interest still in the question of the Persian Gulf War and how that relates to so many other things that affect our lives every day. And I want to thank you very much for turning out tonight, and especially, of course, the people in the university here and in the community who made this meeting possible. I wouldn't be here, though, at all if it were not for a group in Washington, D.C. known as the World Service Authority. They are a human rights group and also an organization that has existed since the early 1950s. They believe that much of the evil in the world derives from nationalism. You know that I had some problems with my passports, don't you? Tracy already mentioned that. And it goes back to the Iranian hostage crisis in late 1979. It was at that time when that hostage crisis started that the Carter administration revoked my passport. It was done rather simply. Cyrus Vance, who was then Secretary of State, simply certified under the regulations that then existed that my activities were causing serious damage to the national security and foreign policy of the United States. And of course I took it as a compliment. I didn't thank him for it, but it didn't help my efforts to travel. The ACLU and my lawyers in New York and others thought that that was unconstitutional, that the Congress had never given the power to the President to revoke or refuse a passport to a U.S. citizen on vague national security grounds. And so we went to court, alleging that this was unconstitutional. And the district court in Washington agreed. But the government appealed to the Court of Appeals, and there we won also, that it was unconstitutional. Then the government appealed to the Supreme Court, and about 2 years after the whole thing started, the Supreme Court, in a truly disgraceful opinion, ruled that it was constitutional, and they overturned the two previous decisions. Well, that didn't mean I couldn't travel, because early on, just a matter of a few weeks after my passport was revoked, I received a letter, an invitation to the first anniversary celebrations of the Grenadian Revolution. You remember the small island that Reagan Bush invaded. Well, this was a letter from Morris Bishop, the leader who was later assassinated, and with that letter he sent me a Grenadian passport. So I had my Grenadian passport to travel all over Western Europe, to the Caribbean, Central America. I went to Grenada another number of times until the invasion. It happened by luck that I was in Managua at the moment of the invasion, and I spoke to the Sandinistas about the problem, the certainty that my passport, my Grenadian passport, would be invalidated as soon as Reagan could get a caretaker or a puppet government in place in Grenada. And the Nicaraguans told me, they said, Phil, we appreciate the work that you've been doing with us. We know you have to travel. We want you to be able to come back here. We are going to give you a Nicaraguan passport. And so I had my Nicaraguan passport to travel all over. Western Europe, the Caribbean, many visits to Managua until last year. I got back last year from a tour just like this one the day before Violeta Chamorro took office, because I was pretty certain that she would respond to U.S. pressure to revoke that Nicaraguan passport that the Sandinistas had given me. But I got home one day before she took office and was waiting, and days went by, weeks went by, the summer went by, and nothing happened. And so I said, well, I'm in luck. They're not going to take that passport away from me. And so my tour organizer in San Francisco organized a tour of some 30 stops in October, November, early December. And in late September, 2 days before I was to go, I had my bags packed. I was ready to go. And ring, 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 a telephone call from New York City telling me that the Nicaraguan government had revoked the passport. Well, I called Managua right away, and friends there checked and called me back telling me that indeed revocation of my Nicaraguan passport was one of the many conditions that the U.S. government is putting on Nicaragua for the release of the money that they've offered. This piddling $500 million, I think it is, has been released in drips and drabs according to how the Chamorro government responds to all of these demands, which are in effect to roll back the revolution. And she is not going to do it. She can't do it. But in any case, little bits of money have been coming out, and my passport was an issue among all those others. So I wasn't able to come because I didn't have a document to go back to Spain, where I live, in Madrid. They can't keep me out of the United States because I'm a U.S. citizen, and every U.S. citizen has a right to be in this country. They can't keep you out. So I could have come back without a passport, but at the end of that trip, I wouldn't have had a document to go back to Spain. So I had to cancel the trip and resolve this problem. And it came in the form of a letter from the World Service Authority that I mentioned earlier in Washington, D.C., explaining to me who they were and the fact that since the early 1950s, they have been issuing passports under the aegis of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which states specifically that each person has the right to leave and to return to their country of origin. They told me that they would be able to help if I wanted their help. And I immediately called them on the phone and I said, I certainly do want your help. Let's get going. And so by January or early February, I had a world passport. There are some 200,000, several hundred thousand of these passports in the hands of people around the world, mostly stateless people and refugees. The passport contains no nationality, only photograph, of course, place and date of birth, occupation, and that kind of thing. I got my passport, and when I received it, I noticed that they had also given me a world residence permit in the passport. World residence permit. It means that I can live anywhere in the world that I want. Local government, of course, permitting. And on the facing page of the passport, it's a terrific-looking document. I've got it up here for anybody who wants to see it later. On the facing page to the world residence permit, I have a world exit permit. I thought at the beginning, that just meant it was an exit permit to go from one country to another. And when I was in Washington seeing them, just after I got back from Madrid here, when I was in Washington to visit, I said, talked about this, and they said, no, Phil, that's to exit the planet. And I said, well, how do I get back? Do I need a re-entry permit or not? He said, no, don't worry about that. Once you get out there, you will never want to come back to this place. Well, I mentioned this passport because some of you might be interested also. It has no nationality, as I mentioned. It's available to anyone. All you have to do is be a person. And the reason I mention this is that in all my passport cases in the courts, and there have been several since the 70s, in every one of those cases, the Department of State and the Justice Department have asserted or insisted, and the courts have accepted, the doctrine that any U.S. citizen who travels abroad on a passport issued by the United States government travels, and this is the operative quote of the documents, travels under the sponsorship of the United States government. Is that a surprise to anybody who has a passport who's traveled abroad? Did you know that when you were traveling abroad, you were traveling under U.S. government sponsorship? Well, the last people that I want to travel, that is to sponsor my travel, is the United States government and, above all, this Bush administration. And so some of you may prefer to travel on your own sponsorship, as I do, and you can get one of these passports if you like. It works, incidentally, it certainly works, and I'll tell you how it worked for me. But for those who have pencil and paper and want to write away for this, it is the World Service Authority. Their address is 1012 14th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C., 20006. 1012 14th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C., 20006. They are a terrific group. They are doing great human rights work all around the world. They are constantly working to help people who may be in prison or jail in some remote area of the world, simply for the lack of a document to leave one country and to enter another. So it's a very important and worthy human rights function. Well, there's no way to tell, really, whether the revocation of my Nicaraguan passport was timed so as to prevent my making this trip over here in the fall, because I was going to give a very similar analysis of the Gulf crisis to what I'm going to give tonight. I had already written it up, and I had to send it to the CIA for censorship, because under a court order from 1980, all of my writings and all of my speeches have to be submitted for censorship to the CIA for the rest of my life before I deliver a speech or publish anything in writing. And so they knew what I was going to say. But if it were timed to stop that trip, it certainly wouldn't be surprising or unusual. This is the same George Bush, after all, who in 1976, when he was director of the CIA, got together with President Ford and with Henry Kissinger, who was then the Secretary of State, and they sent Kissinger over to London on a secret trip to take up my case with the British Prime Minister to start a deportation proceeding against me. I had lived in Britain for 5 years, and I had finished my first book there. I didn't know about this until later, when I got documents under the Freedom of Information Act. But the fact is, Kissinger went over there, and a few weeks after his trip, the Cambridge police came to my house and delivered a deportation notice. We fought that for many months, both politically and legally. But in the end, about 8 months after it started, I had to leave. That was the first of several. because following that, the French arrested me and threw me across the border to Belgium. The Italians arrested and deported me. The West Germans did the same thing. The Dutch did the same thing. The Norwegians refused entry. And for two years, I didn't really know where I was living. During those 2 years, my sons, who were then teenagers, went to 5 different schools in 4 different countries, I believe. Well, this is also the same George Bush who, in the 70s as CIA director, had his people orchestrating a worldwide propaganda campaign around me, a vilification campaign, really. And my files at home are full of articles that appeared all over the world, calling me everything that you can imagine. A defector, a traitor, a Cuban agent, a Soviet agent, a drunk, a womanizer. It's all there. The one I liked best, I think, came from George Will. You know George Will, I can see. Well, in one of his columns, George Will called me a soiled bit of flotsam from the 60s. I thought that was pretty cleverly worded. But in actual fact, he did me a favor. He took a whole decade off my age because I'm really a product of the 50s. Well, I came back to the United States for the first time in about 17 years without a visit in 1987. I had stayed away all those years on legal advice and on political advice from people whose judgment I respect. They had all told me through the years, don't go back, there's been a secret indictment. As soon as you are under the jurisdiction of a U.S. court, they will activate the indictment. You'll have to go through a long and very expensive criminal trial and perhaps even serve a prison sentence of some years. So I stayed away all that time, even though my principal desire, the thing I wanted most in life, was to come back to the States and speak with people just like we are here tonight. But I stayed away until 1987, and during the months before the publication of my latest book, which is on the run, it's a personal memoir of adventures that I lived during the period after I left the CIA and began writing my first book, which is this one here called Inside the Company CIA Diary. That book was going to be published in the summer of 1987, and for months my wife and I debated what to do, whether to go back or not, and in the end we decided to take that risk that I had avoided all of those years. We came back, and in the end, the government took no action at all. They had refused all through those years to state whether there had been an indictment or whether they were going to take action. But in the end, they didn't, and it was certainly worth taking that risk. But as soon as I came back in 1987, soon those types of articles I mentioned before began to appear again here in the United States. And it didn't take George Bush very long to get into the act either. I was not back 3 weeks when Bush gave a speech to the annual convention of the National Association of Broadcasters in Washington, D.C. After his speech during the Q&A, someone stood up and asked, "Mr. Vice President, what do you think of Philip Agee coming back here for the publication of his latest book?" And Bush got this look on his face and he said, "I think that's disgusting and despicable. I have nothing but disdain for that man for what he's done." I suppose he went on like that. But of course I was not there to hear that at that meeting, but within hours, journalists were calling me for my comments on what Bush had said. And I told the journalists, I said, he's wrong. He has been calling me an anti-American for many years. Back in the 70s when he was director of the CIA, he tried to get me put into prison. He did try to get an indictment, couldn't do it. I told the journalist, I'm not an anti-American. If I really wanted to bring harm on my country, I would be out working every day, round the clock, for George Bush for president. You all know, don't you, or you remember, don't you, what General Noriega said about Bush? You remember? It was a couple of years ago before the invasion of Panama. Noriega was speaking with his deputy chief of the Panamanian Defense Forces, who later made this public. Noriega was bragging, and he said to his deputy, he said, "You know, I've really got that George Bush by the balls." And when I read that, I thought, how interesting. One of those rare statements that contain two revelations. Well, we will see if Noriega is ever put on trial. We will see what Noriega has on Bush, but it's my suspicion that this trial, which has already been postponed 4 or 5 times, is going to be postponed still more. Wouldn't be surprising at all if it's postponed until after the '92 elections, so that whatever Noriega has to say about Bush and the past will not come out before those elections and Bush's re-election campaign. Well, we all know, don't we, the reasons why we intervened in the Persian Gulf. We intervened, didn't we? And we killed 100,000 to 200,000 Iraqis, slaughtered them really, in order to restore the legitimate authority in Kuwait. And we did it under the principle, that tried and true all-American principle of politics of one man, one vote. In this case, one man, the emir, and one vote, his. We know the reasons. Bush told us the reasons early on. I remember watching this on television in Madrid. I get U.S. news, and I record it automatically every day, and of course Spanish television was saturated just like it was here. And I saw Bush during those very first days saying, our way of life is at stake. And I kept watching and reading the U.S. press too, for those millions of people who were going to take to the streets immediately in joy, in celebration that their days of hunger were going to end, their days of homelessness would end, or the days of poverty, or the days of illiteracy. But that didn't happen, did it? What we saw instead was George Bush's way of life, boating, fishing, golfing on the coast of Maine like any respectable member of the Eastern elite. We got other reasons why we were intervening in the Persian Gulf as well. We were stopping naked aggression. Remember that one? Naked aggression will not be rewarded, we were told. Then, when the polls were showing increasing concern, major concern in this country over the stability of jobs, James Baker went on television and told us that in the Persian Gulf crisis, jobs in the United States are at stake. And then, if my memory is correct, George Bush went back to stopping naked aggression as the reason. It was a moral principle of black and white. It was good versus evil. And I thought at that time whether Bush simply assumed that Americans had no idea that naked aggression is what made this country what it is. That you can ask any Mexican who knows his or her history. You can ask any Native American. You can ask any African American. Ask any Filipino who knows the history of the U.S. suppression of the Filipino independence movement in the early 1900s, with a savagery that was practically unknown until that time. Well, we heard all those different reasons, but from the early on, there seemed to me to be an alternative explanation, a different analysis of why the United States responded to the crisis in the Gulf. In a nutshell, it's my opinion that a Gulf crisis was needed. A world crisis was needed, and the Gulf was the best place where it could happen. A crisis was needed to substitute or replace the crisis in Western Europe of 40-odd years, which had largely disappeared with the collapse of communism and the chaos in the Soviet Union. That crisis, which was manufactured in the early 1950s, manufactured in order to justify rearmament in the United States as a solution to internal domestic economic problems, had disappeared. That had, however, been the justification for spending something like 65% of the national budget on military purposes. And that justification had to continue unless there would be a conversion of the United States economy to human purposes. And that bright additional threat I'll go into a little further along. But the Gulf crisis has served very well, I think, to continue this idea within the psyche in the United States, the public psyche, of a foreign threat and of the continual crisis abroad, which we learned to live with beginning around 1950. I'll go back to 1950, simply to review a few of the events then and show how they relate directly to what we are living today and the things that affect us here in the United States. There was extreme concern at the very top of the Truman administration in the late 1940s and the early 1950s that the United States was going to return to the extreme conditions of the Great Depression of the 1930s. During those first 4 or 5 years after the end of World War II in 1945, the U.S. economy had declined by something like 20%, an enormous decline in a short period of time. During the same period, unemployment in the United States had gone from almost nothing, 700,000 at the end of the war, to 4.7 million in early 1950. The concern was how to stop the United States from going back to the conditions of the 30s. After all, it was only World War II that took the country out of the Great Depression. One of the problems at that time was that exports from the United States were not sufficient to sustain the economy. For 100 years, it was impossible to consume in this country everything that the nation produced. And so exports were needed, and that is the reason for the open door policy all around the world for more than 100 years, which was the cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy. The problem was that there weren't sufficient exports from the United States because there weren't enough dollars in Europe, principally, to buy U.S. products. It was what was known then as the dollar gap. And so how was the United States going to get enough dollars to Europe to generate imports in Europe from the United States which would sustain the U.S. economy and prevent or avoid going back to that depression situation? The decision taken in early 1950 was militarism, and it's very well documented. Militarism in the sense that the United States would rearm, that the military budget would triple and quadruple in the United States, and that the United States would finance the rearming of Western Europe in order to get those dollars over there. This was going to be a massive increase in military spending, and it was decided at the very top of the Truman administration to do this as a solution to the domestic economic problems. It's all contained in a document which was top secret for 25 years. The name of that document is NSC 68, NSC standing for National Security Council. The document was written by Paul Nitze, who was at that time the chief of the State Department's policy planning staff. Some of you will remember Nitze's name because he was one of Reagan's principal arms negotiators. He's still around. My version of this document, which, by the way, was top secret for 25 years and only in 1975, in error, or through an error, was it made public and published. My copy is about 50 pages long. It's from the 1975 issue of the Naval War College Review. It is an analysis of the entire world and of the domestic situation in the United States, and it lays out militarism, rearmament, as the solutions adopted to cure domestic economic problems. One of the principal phrases in that document is the following: The United States and other free nations will, within a period of a few years at most, experience a decline in economic activity of serious proportions unless more positive governmental programs are developed. Well, the more positive governmental programs developed in accordance with this document was the rearming of the United States and U.S. financing of Western Europe, Western European rearmament. But it didn't happen overnight. Truman could not get this program approved by Congress because of the opposition to it in the Congress and publicly, or in the public at large, because of the tax increases that would be necessary to adopt the program. It wasn't until the Korean War came along that Truman had the issue which he could manipulate in order to get the leverage over Congress and get this program adopted. I'm going to recall how that Korean War was used by Truman. Some will recall here that the Japanese occupied Korea for more than 20 years. And with the collapse of the Japanese at the end of World War II in 1945, the Soviets moved into Korea in the north and the United States in the south. The Soviets and the United States divided supposedly for a temporary period, and they're still divided today, but the country was partitioned at the 38th parallel, with the United States setting up a dictatorship in the South under Syngman Rhee and the Soviets establishing a communist government in North Korea. During those first 4 or 5 years after the partition of Korea in 1945, there were constant clashes between the military forces of North Korea and those of South Korea along that 38th parallel, which was the artificial border between those two states. In late June 1950, the South Koreans made incursions against the North. They were repelled by the North and retreated south, with the North following them. The South Koreans practically gave no battle at all, in effect inviting the North Koreans to follow them south, and this was the beginning of the Korean War. It was called in those days naked aggression on the part of the North Koreans. Well, immediately the United States got resolutions through the UN Security Council, very similarly to what happened last August, authorizing the formation of an international coalition and military force to expel the North Koreans from South Korea. The U.S. rushed troops to South Korea, and so did token forces from the rest of this coalition send their troops, and the North Koreans were stopped. 3 months after it all started, in late September of 1950, the North Koreans had been pushed back to the 38th parallel in coordination with the UN Security Council resolutions adopted at the beginning. It would have all ended right there if, the military part at least, if the United States had accepted a Soviet-sponsored resolution in the United Nations calling for an immediate ceasefire and for elections to reunify Korea. Truman rejected that solution because he had to prolong this crisis and manipulate it in such a way that he could get this leverage over Congress to start the remilitarization program in the United States and in Western Europe. What did he do? Truman sent the U.S. Army into North Korea, advancing toward the Yalu River, which was North Korea's boundary with China. The Chinese, who had just taken control in that country, the Chinese Communists, the year before when they defeated the U.S.-backed Kuomintang regime, which escaped to Taiwan, the Chinese communists threatened to intervene in the war if Truman did not stop the advance of the U.S. Army toward the border with China. Truman did not stop the advance. The Chinese did intervene, and by November there were hundreds of thousands of Chinese communist troops pouring across the border. They stopped the U.S. advance, they defeated the U.S. Army, forced them to go back to the south. By November 1950, the U.S. media was full of photographs and of articles about these tens of thousands of U.S. troops retreating in terrible conditions through ice and snow to the south before these advancing hordes of Chinese communist troops. It was then, in early December, that Truman seized the moment in order to promote his program. He went on national radio, declared a state of national emergency, and said what Bush's remarks about our way of life being at stake reminded me of. Truman mustered all the hype and emotion that he could, and he said, among other things he said, "Our homes, our nation, all the things that we believe in are in great danger. This danger has been created by the rulers of the Soviet Union." In the same speech, he also called again for massive increases in military spending for U.S. and European forces, apart from the needs in Korea. Well, of course, there was no threat at all from the Soviet Union at that time. They were still digging out of the rubble of World War II, in which they had lost 20 million people. But Truman attributed the Korean War falsely to the Soviets in order to create emotional hysteria, a false threat, and to get the leverage over Congress that he needed for this other program. As we know, that deceit by Truman worked. He did get money from Congress, the money that he needed from Congress, and in the first 2 years of this rearmament program that began in 1950, the U.S. military budget more than tripled from $13 billion in 1950 to $44 billion in 1952. During the same period, the U.S. Armed Forces doubled to 3.6 million people. Well, that was the beginning of the permanent war economy that is still with us today. You know that the official figure for the proportion of the federal budget, or the national budget, that goes for military purposes for 1990 was 26%. But the fact is that they leave out many items, very expensive items, which are directly related to the military. For example, that 26% does not include the enormous interest on the national debt from past military expenditures. It does not include the retirement programs for tens of thousands of former Department of Defense employees. Analysts have concluded when they factored in all of the military-related expenditures that the real figure, the true figure, is far over 50%. Some people like Gore Vidal put it at 2/3, or 66% of the national budget going for military purposes. Well, this cannot be justified without a threat. The Soviet threat was manufactured in the early 1950s. They eventually did become a threat, but at the beginning they were not. And the United States poured billions upon billions of dollars into Western Europe, supposedly to defend from that Soviet threat through what they called defense support grants. These were not loans to the European countries. These were grants of money which they would use to rearm. And the same money, those billions of dollars, would then generate imports to Europe from the United States, thus creating more exports, sufficient exports, to sustain the U.S. economy. That's the way it worked back in those early 1950s. Well, that military economy is still with us today, and it cannot be justified if that crisis or threat in Europe has disappeared. What better place to create another crisis than in the Persian Gulf area, where 65% or so of the world's known petroleum resources are located? And what better person to create it than Saddam Hussein? To me, the indicators suggest very strongly, in fact I'm convinced of this, that the United States policy was to convince Saddam Hussein that he could take over Kuwait with impunity. There are lots of indicators. First, in Washington and the Bush administration, they knew perfectly well the historical claims of Iraq over Kuwait. They knew perfectly well that Kuwait had belonged to the southern province of Iraq for hundreds of years during the occupation of that area by the Turkish Ottoman Empire. They also knew perfectly well that in the aftermath of World War I and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the French and the British moved into the area to become the new colonial powers. The French mainly into Lebanon and Syria, the British into the Persian Gulf area. They also knew perfectly well that in 1922, Sir Percy Cox, the British High Commissioner in Baghdad, for the first time in history drew lines in the sand delineating boundaries between what are now Jordan, Iraq, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia. And in so drawing those lines, Sir Percy, acting on orders from London, of course, lopped off Kuwait from the southern province of Iraq. They did that precisely and deliberately to deprive Iraq of a proper seaport on the Persian Gulf. The British wanted no competition from Baghdad, which at that time was the commercial and cultural capital of the region, to their dominance of the Persian Gulf, where they had converted no less than 10 sheikdoms into colonies, including Kuwait. Iraq was left with no coastline, practically, for a proper seaport. And so their only port was Basra, and their only port still is Basra, which is 60 miles or so up the Shatt al-Arab, the estuary of the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. Well, Iraq continued to claim Kuwait following the severance of Kuwait from the southern province of Iraq. In 1961, when the British gave Kuwait independence, the Iraqis massed troops on the Kuwaiti border, threatening to take the territory back by force. The British rushed a military force to Kuwait, and the Iraqis backed down. But they repeated that exercise and threat in 1972 and 1976. All of this history is known to the Bush administration. But there are more immediate Iraqi grievances against Kuwait as well. One of them was the seaport question. For quite some time, Iraq has been demanding that Kuwait lease to Iraq two small uninhabited islands called Bubiyan and Warba, which are right at the top of the Persian Gulf in front of the Iraqi coast, so that the Iraqis could develop them into a proper seaport. Kuwait refused. There was also the question of theft. During the 8-year Iraq-Iran war in the 1980s, the Kuwaitis began extracting large amounts of petroleum from the vast Rumaila oil field, which is all in Iraq except for a very small part, excuse me, a very small part that dips down into a disputed border area, an area disputed between Iraq and Kuwait. And Iraq was demanding that the Kuwaitis pay the billions of dollars that that petroleum was worth. The Kuwaitis refused. There was also the question of the price of oil. In 1986, the OPEC oil ministers had set the world price at $18 a barrel, and they had also set production quotas to sustain that price. But for quite some time, for more than a year, a couple of years in fact, Kuwait had been far exceeding its quota, and so had the United Arab Emirates, another sheikhdom just down the Gulf from Kuwait, and this had driven the price down. Last June, the price was down to $12 to $13 a barrel, which was the best price that the industrialized importing countries had gotten in more than 40 years in constant dollars. This was destroying the Iraqi economy because they had a 80 to $90 billion debt from their war with Iran, much of that owed to the Kuwaitis and the Saudis. And the Iraqis were also demanding that the Kuwaitis forgive those loans, because after all, in the war, in which they were supported by Kuwait and totally by the United States against Iran, the Iraqis had stopped the spread of Islamic fundamentalism into the Arab countries of the Persian Gulf. And so the Iraqis demanded forgiveness of those loans. The Kuwaitis refused. Well, in July, mid-July, the OPEC oil ministers met in Geneva. This is this past July. At that time, the Iraqis massed 30,000 troops on the Kuwaiti border to pressure Kuwait into accepting new quotas and also to accept some of their other demands. That worked for the Iraqis in a limited way. The Kuwaitis did accept a new price. It went up from $18 to $21 a barrel as a world price, and also new production quotas were set, and Kuwait accepted what Kuwait was given. But in the days following, Saddam Hussein did not withdraw those troops from the Kuwaiti border. He more than tripled them to 100,000 troops. And this was the situation when the U.S. ambassador met face-to-face with Saddam Hussein on the 25th of July last year. Already the United States had signaled to Hussein that he might be able to get away with a move against Kuwait. In April, the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Middle Eastern Affairs, John Kelly, testified before Congress that the United States has no commitment to defend Kuwait. At the moment when April Glaspie, the U.S. ambassador, meets with Saddam Hussein, Hussein has 100,000 troops poised for invasion of Kuwait. The Iraqis secretly recorded this meeting, and in September they made a transcript public, which was widely circulated. I know a lot of you know about it already. But the important thing is that at that time the Department of State did not deny, or that is, they did not dispute the accuracy of this transcript. In fact, in October, Margaret Tutwiler, the spokesperson of the Department of State, said that it was essentially accurate. Well, what happened in that meeting? In that meeting, the U.S. ambassador says to Hussein, "Mr. President, I have a direct instruction from Secretary of State Baker to emphasize to you that in your disputes with Kuwait, your border disputes, the United States has, quote unquote, no opinion." She also said that she had an instruction from President Bush to seek better relations with Iraq. Saddam Hussein, for his part, on several occasions, said that the Kuwaiti actions against Iraq, all of them taken together, were the equivalent of war, of economic warfare against Iraq. It was destroying the Iraqi economy, he said, and they are not going to tolerate it. They are going to take whatever action is necessary to stop it. It was tantamount to saying that he was going to take military action against Kuwait. Well, there was not one word of warning from the U.S. ambassador at that meeting with Saddam Hussein, one word of warning against invasion or military action by Iraq against Kuwait, and that with 100,000 troops poised for an invasion. That very same day in Washington, the same Assistant Secretary of State, John Kelly, cancels a Voice of America broadcast that had been planned and that had as its content a statement by the United States that with the rising tensions in the Persian Gulf, the United States would come to the defense of its friends, including Kuwait, if necessary. Kelly canceled that broadcast. It was meant to be a signal to Hussein, by the way, and it was canceled. At the same time, a prohibition went out that there would be no warning to any of the thousands of people who might become hostages in the event of an Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. Then, 2 days before the invasion, the same Assistant Secretary of State Kelly testifies a second time before Congress that the United States has no commitment to defend Kuwait. Meanwhile, the CIA and the intelligence services are predicting this invasion at least 6 days before it happens. When you read the reports that are out in the newspapers this morning on the resignation of William Webster as director of the Central Intelligence Agency, you see this information. I've read the New York Times and one other newspaper, I think it was USA Today, and they are saying that the CIA did not predict the invasion and that Webster had come under attack for not predicting the invasion or not saying it was going to happen. That's totally false. They did. They did predict the invasion. Senator Boren, who is the chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, has said that the CIA was predicting it 6 days in advance. And the new Bob Woodward book on this crisis, in that he also says the CIA and the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, were predicting it before it happened. The incredible matter is that during that week between the ambassador's meeting with Hussein and the invasion itself, the Bush administration took no action to stop it. And they could have stopped it. They could have avoided this entire crisis, knowing that it was coming. For example, Bush could have gotten resolutions through the UN Security Council, just as he did after the invasion happened. Those resolutions through emergency sessions of the UN Security Council could have sent a signal to Saddam Hussein that the international community would not tolerate any move to take over Kuwait. Bush could also have rushed a military force, a multinational military force to Kuwait as another signal to Hussein that if he moved against Kuwait, he would be fighting the international community, including the United States. And he had time to do it, like the British had rushed troops in 1961 when they gave Kuwait independence. There could have been public warnings. There could have been all kinds of things done, but Bush did not do one thing to prevent that invasion when he knew it was happening. And that is why I conclude that it was a wanted crisis. Bush wanted to have the invasion and wanted to have Hussein believe that he could take over Kuwait or invade and get away with it. Well, why? I go back to this crisis. We have lived a constant crisis since the late 1940s, or at least 1950. If that crisis in Europe had disappeared and a new crisis was needed, we found it in the Persian Gulf. Going back to 1950, I want to mention here that the CIA was a very important instrument for fighting what was known as the Cold War, the East-West dimension. But there was also a very important North-South dimension of the Cold War. It is my impression that what Bush talks about when he talks about a new world order isn't really so new at all. It looks like an institutionalization or an attempt to institutionalize what was the North-South dimension of the Cold War. That is the war against the Third World, which is where the fighting really took place, as in Vietnam. That was a war for the resources and the markets and the labor of Third World countries. Today and every day, the United States is more dependent, and so are the U.S. allies, more and more dependent on the resources of the so-called Third World. Bush, in this Gulf crisis, of course, has sent a signal to every aspiring Third World country, every aspiring leader in those countries, that the United States will not stand for radical nationalism when it is seen to affect adversely U.S. interests. He has sent a signal around the world that the United States will smash militarily any radical nationalist movement which affects U.S. interests. Well, going back to 1950 or to the late 1940s, the CIA was one of the principal instruments in waging this Cold War. The CIA was established, for those who don't know, in 1947 with the passage of the National Security Act of that year. That same law, or that law, set up the CIA as the National Intelligence Service. The same law established the National Security Council as the highest policy-making body in matters of national security, foreign affairs, and defense. According to the law, which is still in effect today, the National Security Council, or NSC as it's known, is chaired by the President of the United States and has as statutory members the Vice President, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, and two or three other officials at that level. It is the body which, sitting together, determines U.S. foreign policy. The CIA then, as soon as it was established, started setting up offices around the world to collect information, send the information back to Washington, have it processed there, and then present it in a usable fashion to the President and other policymakers. Obviously, that is what an intelligence service should do. Collect information, process it, and then pass it to the people who need it for their decisions. And I would like to say right here now that I believe the United States needs an intelligence service. But we need an intelligence service that is used to keep the peace, not one that is used to wage terrorist war against defenseless peasants in Central America. We need an intelligence service to keep the peace, and by that I mean to avoid accidental nuclear war with the Soviet Union, or war with the Soviet Union by miscalculation. I'm referring here to the worldwide systems for monitoring communications and electronic emissions, to the overhead reconnaissance programs through the satellites. These programs are extremely important for avoiding war, avoiding nuclear war by accident or miscalculation. The systems are so important, in fact, that both the Soviet Union and the United States have agreed in writing, formally, never to interfere with each other's systems, what they call national technical means of collection. Well, the CIA did indeed start collecting information from the beginning, but from the beginning it was doing other things as well. At the very first meeting of the National Security Council in October 1947, with President Truman in the chair, and this was 1 month after Truman had signed the National Security Act into law. At that first meeting, the decision was taken to set aside $10 million, a huge amount of money in those days, $10 million for the CIA to secretly intervene in the Italian national elections that were scheduled about 6 months later, for early April 1948. $10 million. Well, why would the National Security Council, the President of the United States, seek to intervene secretly in the national elections of Italy? It was because of fear. Fear that a left-wing coalition would win those elections. This left coalition, known as the Popular Bloc, was, or included the Communist Party, the Socialist Party, various other parties on the left, and these left-wing forces had been the backbone of more than 20 years of resistance to fascism in Italy. And they had come out of the fascist period, out of World War II, with great prestige and strength. The fear was that they would win the elections. This money, this $10 million, was passed by the CIA secretly to the Christian Democratic Party, the conservatives, through front organizations in Italy, through Italian-American organizations in this country, and through the Vatican. In the end, it worked very well. The Christian Democrats won the elections going away when they were held in April 1948, and it was not the end. During the next 25 years, the CIA gave secretly more than $100 million to the Christian Democratic Party in Italy to sustain them in power. As late as 1976, President Ford approved a $6 million subsidy to the Christian Democratic Party for elections that were to be held in June 1976. Well, the Christian Democratic Party, ever since that first election operation of the CIA, has dominated every single one of the 50 different Italian governments since that election. Only 3 weeks ago or so, they formed their 50th government. Again, the Christian Democrats are dominating the coalition. It wasn't just in Italy, though. Try to imagine that this is done all over the world. CIA secret money going to political parties, going to individual politicians, going to factions within certain parties. I was doing this myself in Latin America. in the 1960s. These activities in elections, which are known as election operations within the CIA, are one form of intervention in the affairs of other countries, secret intervention, known as covert action operations. Covert action operations, as opposed to collection operations, are the ways that the CIA seeks to intervene secretly to control the course of events in other countries, to manipulate the affairs of other countries. It is done through the penetration and the manipulation of the institutions of power of other countries. And I'm talking about the governments, the political parties, the military and security services, the trade unions, youth and student organizations, women's organizations, religious organizations, and in a very big way, the public information media. I was involved in these types of operations, all of these types of operations, when I was down in Latin America. Media operations, for one, are some of the most important. The CIA's media operations consist mainly in paying secretly a journalist to use the CIA's material as if it were the journalist's own. They are vast, from newspapers and magazines and academic and learned journals to radio, to television, to cinema. Their purpose is the same purpose as the mainstream media have in the United States, and that is thought control. That is the purpose of the mainstream media here, and they do their job very well. Well, the CIA is paying a lot of money to do the very same thing through what would be called the mainstream media in countries around the world. The same in trade unions. I could speak for days probably on the CIA's operations in trade union operations, because they're vast. They circle the globe and are on a national and an international level. The purpose is to co-opt the trade union movement, to co-opt the international and national working class movements of different countries, because here in the United States, governments have never really trusted the working class movement anyway, and so they try to do that abroad. These operations can also be coordinated in order to undermine a government, to destabilize a government. And these are the operations wherein the CIA seeks to overthrow governments, usually democratically elected civilian governments, replacing them with military dictatorships. This happened twice while I was working or in operations in which I was involved in South America in the 60s. The record is very long for these types of operations of overthrowing governments. One of the early ones is in Iran, when there is a civilian, democratically elected government which had nationalized the petroleum industry, which until that time had been a British monopoly. The CIA, at the order of President Eisenhower, began operations to undermine that government and provoked a military coup. And in the aftermath, or right at the time, in fact, they installed the Shah as virtual military dictator. The same happened in Guatemala the following year. There was a mildly reformist 10-year governmental program in Guatemala, and in 1954, the CIA undermined that government, in fact, starting in 1953, but leading into the 54, undermined the government and eventually provoked a military coup and established a military dictatorship. This has happened all around the world. I only mentioned those few examples. There is another type of operation in which I was also involved, called liaison operations. Liaison operations are all of those activities that the CIA undertakes with the security and intelligence services of other countries. The British intelligence service was one of the most important at the beginning. After all, they had trained and established the predecessor organization of the CIA, the Office of Strategic Services, during World War II. But early on also, the CIA began setting up intelligence and security services in other countries. One of the first places was in Greece. There, in the aftermath of the Greek Civil War from 1947 to 49, in which the United States intervened massively on the part of the winning side, the far right in Greece, in the aftermath, the CIA established an internal security service called the KYP, or KEEP, KYP being the Greek letters for CIA. They gave the same name. This was the instrument through which the CIA helped the conservatives stay in power in Greece for nearly 20 years. And when I say conservatives, I don't mean mild conservatives. It was the far right in Greece. In 1967, when their hold on power was threatened through upcoming elections, The CIA with the KYP, or KEEP, organized a military coup against the civilian government and ushered in 7 years of fascist military dictatorship in Greece. During that period, torture became widespread, and thousands of Greeks were forced into political exile. The same thing happened in Iran in 1953, following the coup that I mentioned before. In the aftermath, the CIA set up an internal security service for the Shah, known as the SAVAK. In 1953, following the coup that I mentioned before. In the aftermath, the CIA set up an internal security service for the Shah, known as the SAVAK. The SAVAK was the instrument through which the Shah sustained his regime for 25 years. They became famous the world over for their torture chambers and their assassinations of the Shah's political enemies. I remember very well clips from Dutch television taken of a SAVAK torture chamber or torture center in Tehran just after the overthrow of the Shah in 1979. This was a building where the torture center was in the ground floor, and in fact the floor was dirt. This room, which was in these film clips, had steel beds with tiers of steel mesh, and the torturers would build coal fires on the ground floor and on the dirt floor, and they would put the person to be interrogated on the top tier. And little by little, the person would be lowered until finally the person was barbecued alive. There is a CIA analyst by the name of Jesse Leaf who worked on Iranian affairs and who went public in the early 1980s after the fall of the Shah and the destruction of the SAVAK as an organization. He described how the CIA had sent trainers in torture to Iran to help the SAVAK. There are many other examples. I might just mention Guatemala as well. In the aftermath of the overthrow of the civilian government in Guatemala in 1954, the CIA began setting up internal security services in Guatemala. That country has had a military dictatorship ever since that operation in 1954. Sometimes, at certain periods, they have had figurehead civilian presidents, as just recently and now. But in actual fact, everyone knows that in Guatemala, it's the military that have ruled in that country ever since the CIA's operation in 1954. These security services that the CIA set up then spawned the death squads in Guatemala that have gone under so many other names and that have then appeared in other Central American countries such as Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, under Somoza, and so forth. No one knows how many people in Guatemala have been murdered by these CIA-instituted instruments of repression. Some people say over the years of 100,000, some people say 125,000, some people say 150,000. The truth is no one will ever know how many because records are not kept. But it is astronomical, and it is an enormous, enormous tragedy for the Guatemalan people. The same can be said of El Salvador. El Salvador, you know, has received more than $4 billion from the United States, the succession of death squad governments in El Salvador for the last 10 or 11 years. You can be as sure as you are of your own name that over all this time, 10 or 11 years, the CIA has been in there working hand in glove with the various Salvadoran security services, which is to say the same thing as with the death squads, giving them training, equipment, guidance, information, and so forth, so that they can go out and pick up at will any aspiring trade unionist, any aspiring student leader, any human rights activist. These are the types of people they have picked up. And they have killed now the figure is up to 80,000 or more during just these 10 years. That death squad government is receiving $1 million today as we sit here. And they have received, as I say, a total of something like $4 billion during these 10 or 11 years of U.S. support that started with the Reagan administration in 1981. Well, I could go on and on about these liaison operations. I was involved in those also in Latin America. But I think you get the flavor of those operations just from the few examples I've given. I could go on all night about these death squads and security services that murder the people of their own country. Well, I don't think it's enough really to describe simply what we do abroad through the CIA or mention the slaughter of 200,000 Iraqis. Of course, what we did in the Persian Gulf, some of you may agree with me, what we did was what the United States does best these days, but cannot finance itself. That is to make war and be financed in it by people who make things that people around the world want, like VCRs and cars, in other words, the Germans and the Japanese. With a $3.5 trillion national debt, if you can think in those terms, 800 billion of it owned by foreigners, it seemed to me that it was only a matter of time before the U.S. Armed Forces would be sent abroad like one more export. And that is precisely what happened in this case. It became a classical mercenary operation, and it will make money. About 4 weeks ago, the Congressional Budget Office published its analysis of the cost of the war. The Congressional Budget Office, you know, is an arm of Congress. And the figure came to $40 billion. That same day in the White House, a few hours later, Fitzwater announces that, no, we don't accept that $40 billion. We have pledges of $55 billion, and we're going to make sure that we get every last cent of it. Well, it doesn't take an accountant to understand that there's going to be an enormous profit on this war, and it could even be as high as $15 billion. I said it's not enough simply to describe these things that we do abroad, slaughtering Iraqis or overthrowing democratically elected governments or helping to institutionalize torture in some country or another, or working with the death squads, and I could give so many more examples, but there's not time. It is important, though, very important to me, though, to pose the question of why we as a society do these things abroad. Why as a nation, as a country, do we do these things all around the world? When I was a CIA trainee, I was taught that the Soviet Union's foreign policy, its belligerence, its expansionism, was a direct product and outgrowth of its domestic system. That is, the needs of the Soviet Communist Party to maintain and retain a monopoly on power in the Soviet Union. I think any political scientist would agree that a society's or a nation's foreign affairs, their foreign policy, is a direct product of the domestic system. So if we want to answer the question of why we do these things abroad, in my opinion, we have to look at the domestic system in the United States. And what do we have here in the United States? Well, we have a whole series of crises, don't we? Which all taken together give the picture or show the picture of a society really in profound crisis. We all know that 1 in 3 Americans is illiterate, either totally or to the degree that they cannot function in a society based on the written word. 1 in 3 in poverty, either totally or absolutely, or to in and out, or to the degree that they are never free from want. We also know that we have a disgraceful participation in the political process in this country. Only 2 of 3 potential voters or eligible voters even registers to vote. And of those who do register, only about 80% do vote. That means that we have a turnout in national elections in the United States of about 50% of the eligible voters. It means also that we elect someone like George Bush as president with 24 or 25% of the eligible vote, of the potential vote. Well, the reasons why people don't vote are very complex, but not the least of them is the feeling, I'm sure, that one more vote is not going to change anything. We also know other crises. Right here in Montana, you have problems, I'm sure, I know, of destruction of the environment. We have the problems of the infrastructure in the United States. We have problems of racism, drugs, violence of every kind, everywhere. All of these crises are getting worse all the time. They are not being solved. Why? Well, one of the very good reasons why is that the U.S. military budget takes up 65% or so of the federal budget. That money is not available, for example, for renewing the infrastructure or for eliminating the drug crisis or solving it, or for education. We have the worst educational system, you know, of all the developed countries. And our low popular participation in elections, for example, is a disgrace. If you knew what the turnout was in Western Europe, in those democracies over there. Well, just imagine what this country would be like if we did convert the economy to human, to peaceful purposes, and we began to solve the crises, if we began to overcome the crises, if we began, for example, to have an informed electorate in this country. If we had an informed electorate and we had a better educational system, we might have real debate of substantive issues in the political process. We would not, for example, have the three major issues of the 1988 campaign in a national election. We would have real issues. What were those three issues? The sanctity of a piece of cloth, the pledge allegiance to the flag, and of course the Willie Horton racial smear. Those were the three issues in the 88 elections. But if we had an educated electorate, we might have discussion of real issues. And if we overcame poverty at the same time, and some of those other crises, we might even have the threat in the United States of a second political party. The system might have to be changed. There might be easier ballot access for political organizations. There might be the threat of proportional representation, like in West Germany, for example, where there is a 5% cutoff. Any group that gets 5% of the vote gets representation in the Bundestag, in the parliament. But here we re-elect 95 to 97% of the incumbents every election. I mean, what's democratic about that? Are they all that good? No, what we would have in this country, if we solved the domestic crises, we would have a threat in this country of a different sort. We would have a threat of democracy in the United States if we solved the domestic crisis. Talking about the domestic situation, when I came back here after all those years without a visit, when I came back in 1987, you remember what we were doing, don't you? Come on, you remember, don't you? We were celebrating the 200th anniversary of the rules of the game for our domestic society. 200th anniversary of the Constitution. I know a lot of people out there revere the Constitution like we are supposed to revere the Constitution, like the Bible or whatever holy book we use. We're taught that from the earliest age. But when I came back and saw that orgy of self-congratulation during the celebrations of the constitutional 200 years, they reminded me of a passage in Noam Chomsky's wonderful book on Central America called Turning the Tide. In that book, he discusses the Constitutional Convention of 1787, where our domestic system comes from, where 55 men met in total secrecy. Not one word was known of what they said for more than 50 years after the convention. They didn't want anybody to know what they were saying because they were plotting. They were there to find solutions to problems in governing under the Articles of Confederation, but in fact what they did was pull off a coup d'etat against the old government. Chomsky writes that the question arose at the Constitutional Convention, who really is to govern the United States? And the answer came from John Jay. John Jay, the lawyer, the president, you'll recall, of the Continental Congress, which had fought the war for independence against Britain, and he was also the first Chief Justice of the United States, of the Supreme Court. John Jay had the answer. He said, well, of course, the people who own the United States ought to govern it. And so they wrote the Constitution along that theme. They wrote the Constitution in order to protect and enhance their personal wealth and that of the people they represented, and of course to ensure the power that goes with it. Who were those people and those they represented? They were the lawyers, the bankers, the merchants, the landowners, the slaveholders, and so forth, the elite of colonial society. And in writing the Constitution, they wrote completely out of the political process 95% of the population. All of the men without property, all of the indentured laborers, all of the Native Americans, they were considered savages, all of the African Americans, they were slaves mostly, and of course half the population, all the women. And they had the gall to begin the Constitution with the phrase, "We, the people of the United States." That was their document for 5%. As if the 95%, it don't matter. Well, I mention this because I take a book with me every place I go among this little mini book fair that I set up, which I tell students, in fact I tell everybody, but especially students, that this could be the best $10 they would spend on a book in their 4, 5, 6 years in university. It is this one in purple on the right called Toward an American Revolution. It is by Jerry Frazier, a PhD in history from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. It is a story about the Constitution, who the people were, what were their interests, and how did they get this Constitution rammed down the throats of the states for ratification. One thing you will agree with me on, I'm sure, after you've read that book, is that the last thing that the Founding Fathers had in mind when they wrote that Constitution was democracy. They wrote it for the few, and they wrote it for the privileged few. There is no way to dispute this. But as far as ratification is concerned, as Jerry points out, the Constitution was ratified mostly by the states, by state legislatures who were the counterparts on the state level of the people who wrote the Constitution. Only one state submitted the Constitution to popular referendum. And even among the few who could vote in the referendum in Rhode Island, the Constitution lost by 13-1. So you will see that it was not a revered document in those days. Well, I raise this question of the Constitution because despite 200 years of legislation, despite 25 odd amendments to the Constitution is still the rules of the game. And, in my opinion, the people who own the United States still govern it. That is the problem with which we're faced today. We have a country in which 2% of the people, that is 2% of the families in the United States, own 54% of the net financial assets of this country. They are the ones who the Bush administration, the Reagan administration, go all the way back to George Washington. They are the ones that are served by government. This Constitution was the original pact between the political forces, as you would see in this book by Jerry Frazier, the original pact between the political forces to make the political debate in the United States very narrow and to make the rules of the game extremely hard to change. That is why in 200 years there have only been some 20-odd changes or amendments. This is the source of the problem, really, or source of the situation, wherein when we go out and vote today, selecting between Democrats and Republicans, we are really only choosing between, on the one hand, Tweedledum, and on the other, Tweedledee, because they speak of one mouth.
Is that kind of like King James editing the Bible?
I think Tweedledum, no. Well, I mention all this because, in my opinion, I lay it out for you to consider. Unless and until we have fundamental, radical change in the domestic system in the United States, we are not going to have real democracy. We are going to have elitist control of the United States continuing from the very beginning 200 years ago, and that elite will be served by these terrible things that we do abroad. That is, that they do abroad, but use us to do sometimes. The grisly CIA operations, the interventions around the world. Well, on this trip, a number of people have asked me to comment on personal motivation, given what they call their disappointment, or their discouragement is what they've said, with the fact that with hundreds of thousands of people marching, it was impossible to stop George Bush have his war. And I've said a number of places that disappointment, yes, but discouragement, no. that those of us who feel active in the peace movement, who want to see diplomatic and peaceful settlements of conflicts, we have to realize and never forget that we still live in an age of imperialism. We live in the imperialist power on the earth today, and it's going to be like that for some years to come. That imperial system invests enormous amount of power in a person like George Bush. But that doesn't mean it's not worth trying to stop these crises. And remember that this Persian Gulf crisis might be the most recent crisis of the continuing crises since the late 1940s or around 1950 with the Korean War, but it is not by any means the last. Bush has people in the National Security Council right now planning the next crisis. The State Department does too. The CIA does too. The Pentagon does too. Because we have lived, that is what has sustained this whole system of war economy in the United States for more than 40 years. The Persian Gulf crisis may be the most recent, but is not the last. The next one could come again in Korea. South Korea is threatening war against North Korea because the North Koreans will not allow international inspection of their nuclear facilities. The North Koreans say, and incidentally the South Koreans are saying, that the North Koreans are going nuclear in a weapons program. They're threatening war. The North Koreans say, we will allow full international inspection of our nuclear facilities if the United States will take out of South Korea those nuclear weapons which are aimed at us. The United States and South Koreans say, no, those nuclear weapons are staying in South Korea aimed at the North. Well, what can you expect from the North Koreans? But a new crisis also could come in Central America very, very easily. Colin Powell was just down there, and he was talking of the real possibility of the introduction of U.S. combat forces in El Salvador to fight the FMLN. If that were to happen, incidentally, that raising of that possibility is really an admission of the failure of these 10 or 11 years of U.S. policy, because U.S. policy all this time with those $4 billion has been a military solution, hasn't it? And it has not come. The FMLN is as strong as it ever was, and it continues to control large portions of El Salvador. That U.S.-backed military regime, death squad government, has not been able to make headway against the FMLN. And so now Colin Powell is talking about the introduction of U.S. combat forces there. Well, if that were to happen, you can be very sure that they would also be attacking the Nicaraguan army, which is still under Sandinista control, as are the security forces and the police and so forth in Nicaragua. That would mean an all-out war spread through Central America. Just the sort of thing that so many millions of people worked to avoid during the 1980s when Reagan was in the White House. Well, it now looks like it may come back up again as a possibility with Bush in the White House. Still, closer to home, a new crisis can very well occur at any moment with Cuba. I was just in Cuba for a week in March, and I can tell you that they are very worried. They know that the Cuban Revolution is incompatible with Bush's concept of a new world order or new international order. They are in the greatest crisis themselves, the worst crisis since the triumph of the revolution in 1959. And I think in 20 years of coming and going from Cuba and working in solidarity with the Cuban Revolution, this was probably my most interesting visit. It was extremely intensive. I talked to many, many different people in different fields, and I learned quite a bit about the Cuban solutions that are already underway, the programs underway for solving the crisis that has come about because of the collapse of their trading partners in Europe and the chaos in the Soviet Union. I'll be glad to talk about Cuba during the discussion session if anyone wants to bring up the subject. There is a real possibility, by the way, that Americans who want to go to Cuba to work in productive agriculture for some weeks could go in brigades that might be formed here in the United States, like the brigades that went to Nicaragua before. Well, one of the matters that I try to emphasize in all these talks is the need to stay mobilized. The need to stay mobilized. One cannot mobilize once a crisis has hit, because then it's too late. And that is why it was very gratifying to me this afternoon to be talking to some people here that the coalition which was formed against the war here has maintained some sort of unity, and I hope that will certainly continue, because there's the need for all kinds of action now to try to anticipate, to denounce that this new crisis is going to be coming, and not wait until Bush has manufactured it, until he has provoked the crisis with Cuba, for example. The solidarity work, of course, is very important to continue. The FMLN in El Salvador needs our solidarity now as much as they ever did, and they certainly deserve it. So does the FSLN in Nicaragua. I might mention also Cuba, but not forgetting the Palestinians. The Palestinians need our solidarity also, and they will have a homeland sooner or later. They will have it. One other factor is a personal factor. Anyone who makes a commitment to get involved in political activism, in peace work, or get involved just generally in one of the various issues that face us, realizes, I'm sure, that there is no way to stay in for the long haul without constantly renovating, constantly renewing the intellectual or ideological basis upon which we take action, right? It can only come through reading, and that is why I bring this mini book fair along. And I urge all of you to look over these publications. There are marvelous publications coming out, periodicals, books of all sorts. It is pretty thin right now because I'm at the end of this tour, but people have taken enormous amounts of publications on this tour because they do realize how important it is. But when you talk about books, you have to be very careful. We must never forget what Congressman Harold Velde of Illinois had to say about books when I was a university student back in the 1950s. Congressman Velde was speaking in the House of Representatives in Washington, get this, in opposition to the mobile public library service in rural America. Among other things, Velde said, educating Americans through the library service could bring about a change of their political attitude quicker than any other method. And he went on to say, the basis of communism and socialistic influence is education of the people. You can find that in the Congressional Record. It's one of Howard Zinn's gems of research. Well, there is another matter that's coming up pretty quick here, and that is CIA recruiting on campus. And I have traveled very far and wide in this movement to keep the CIA off campus. After all, there is no justification for Murder Incorporated coming onto the college campuses of the United States to recruit young people into that work. And I have extended these events of mine beyond the talk and the discussion and the mini book fair and so forth, because as we heard already, I am trying to organize workshops for CIA off-campus activities everywhere I go. And there are some experts who are already excuse me, capable of doing that. One of them, who would probably come here at one point, lives in Palo Alto. Her name is Amy Mills. And Amy wrote the book on this. The title of the book is called The CIA Off Campus, A Do-It-Yourself Handbook. She is one of the former student defendants that were on trial for CD at Northwestern in opposition to CIA recruitment there just a couple of years ago. Well, this book is a marvelous thing, and I was taking it all over until suddenly there are no more copies. But I'm going to make sure that people who are interested here will have copies to read, perhaps before the visit of the CIA people here next week. But you will get copies, those who are interested. And the sign-up sheet here will be for those people who would like to participate in activities against their visit coming up, but also who would be interested in participating in say a 3-hour workshop that could be held on a Saturday or Sunday, in which Amy would come here and conduct the workshop. You would not only learn a lot about the CIA, but you would learn, as is contained in her book, the experiences of faculty, students, and community, because where it's worked, it hasn't been just students, it has been all three groups, faculty, community, and students, in their experiences from coast to coast, north and south, and all over the country. It is a marvelous book and shows enormous ingenuity on the part of the people who are involved. There's one final matter I want to announce or mention, and that is that a month ago I participated in a press conference at the United Nations in New York with Ramsey Clark, the former Attorney General, to announce the establishment of a war crimes tribunal to try to get the facts out about U.S. and Allied war crimes in the Persian Gulf and Iraqi war crimes in Kuwait. The day of our press conference, the first delegation left for Amman and went on to Baghdad. The purpose is to gather information at this point on possible violations of the Geneva Conventions of 1947. You know, the Geneva Conventions very specifically spell out what are war crimes. For example, it is a war crime to target civilians. It is a war crime to target the life support systems for civilians. Water, electricity, sewage, for example. It is a war crime to target retreating soldiers who have thrown down their weapons and have no way of defending themselves. And we all saw the television clips, I'm sure, of the highways going to the north with those thousands of Iraqi bodies, thousands of people who were simply slaughtered by U.S. aviation. Well, it's very important to get people from the inside to step forward and tell what they know. If any of you know of anyone who is there, a family member or a friend or a member of a family that is a friend of yours, or third, fourth, fifth hand, if you can get the word out to those people that if they know anything and want to step forward, they will receive a very friendly welcome at the War Crimes Tribunal. And they will be able to make the information known in whatever way they want to. The tribunal is headquartered in Ramsey Clark's office in New York City. If anybody wanted the address, I could give it to you. I have it right here. But I will mention that in my own case, something just by chance occurred. A few weeks ago, I was in my hometown in Tampa, Florida. A friend was taking me to the airport, and on the drive out, he said, "Hey, Phil, you know, something interesting has happened. My neighbor has a friend whose son is in the Persian Gulf. He's in Iraq with the army. And he has written home to his mother that he saw with his own eyes GIs executing Iraqi POWs. And he wants to go public and make that known." So some things apparently have happened there, and the whole purpose of this tribunal is to bring it out in a way that it will help prevent the next intervention like this Persian Gulf intervention, and also at the same time be a useful tool for political education. There will be hearings in the United States in different parts, in North Africa, in Europe, and in the Middle East. And by October, it is hoped that there will be a 9-person tribunal of eminent jurists who will receive the information, evaluate it, and eventually this information will be made available to the International Court of Justice at The Hague. Well, in the end, what I think we should do is to spread the truth about Bush's lies and hypocrisy on the Gulf and his bombing of Iraq back to the pre-industrial stage, as was the judgment of the UN mission that went out there just as the fighting ended. Why? For his own re-election and for the continuation of militarism in the United States. You know that Colin Powell favored sanctions. That's all come out now. And in the Woodward book, when Colin Powell was speaking to Bush about letting the sanctions work, Bush said, "I don't think there's time politically for that strategy." Well, of course the sanctions would have worked, but as Powell believed, and others did too, they would have taken a year perhaps, or 2 years even, to work, that is, to force Hussein out of Kuwait. But back in late September and early October, when Bush was saying, remember, the sanctions are working, he made up his mind that he would have to go to war. And that is when he made that remark to Powell. Why? Because if they took as much as 2 years to work, what would be happening then? Bush would be in his re-election campaign looking like Jimmy Carter did in 1980. Irresolute, unable to get Hussein out of Kuwait, unable to solve this international problem. And it might have hurt him drastically in the elections. So it seems to me he made the decision to exchange as many lives as possible for his re-election. And remember, at that time, the experts were saying tens of thousands, or they were predicting tens of thousands of U.S. casualties. No one knew it was going to be a walkover the way it was. And of course, who cares about the hundreds of thousands Iraqis? After all, they have darker skin, they have another religion, they are third world people, and we treat those third world people, of course, the way we treat them in the United States. Well, when Bush does run for re-election next year, our job is going to be, and when he does run for election next year, our job is going to be, in part, to reject his boast that he made the world safe from Saddam Hussein. And in addition to that, our job will be to eject him from the White House in order to make the world safe from George Bush himself. Thank you all very much for coming. You mean how much money was made by Hull himself, or?
By the powers that be.
I couldn't tell you. I have never believed that the CIA was involved in drug running for money to finance its operations. They get all that money from Congress. They don't need to go into the drug business for financing their operations. But they have been involved in drug running since the very beginning. It started in France in the late 1940s, when the CIA made an alliance with the Corsican Mafia to help them break strikes in the port of Marseille, for example, and other ports. And they have been involved with the drug trade ever since. The standard book on this, the best I know of, is Al McCoy's book, which I'm sure some of you have seen. It's called The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia. But where Central America is concerned, there is every reason to believe, I think, that because of the illegal contra-resupply operations run out of Bush's office, in which cocaine was brought back into the United States and landed at U.S. military bases, for that reason alone, Bush ought to be, instead of in the White House, underneath the jail, in prison. How much Hull made, I don't know. Hull, you know, is living on his farm in Indiana. He's under indictment in Costa Rica, and his ranch was one of the principal resupply points for the Eden Pastora group on the south, operating along the Costa Rican border. But the amount of money involved, I don't know. I do know, however, that what is the man's name? Milian Rodriguez, a Cuban exile who had worked for the CIA for many years, delivered $10 million of drug money in cash to Felix Rodriguez at the Ilopango Air Base in the mid-1980s, where the resupply operation was going on. And of course, these illegal resupply operations were being run by Donald Gregg in Bush's office, his national security advisor, who is now, of course, instead of being in prison, he is U.S. ambassador to South Korea. So I couldn't tell you the details on the whole money, but I suppose you've seen the book Out of Control by Leslie Colburn, which goes into the Hull affair very well, and the whole Christie case is built around the Hull Ranch used by the CIA as well.
I have one other question. It's a curiosity thing. To what degree is the Center for Disease Control, CDC, in Atlanta involved in information gathering regarding human health and exposure to various chemistries that are going on around the country in the thousands of forms that we're subjected to, whether it's food additives or whatever? Do you know anything about that?
I don't know for sure. You'd have to ask someone who is a doctor or who knows better than I do what the centers do in Atlanta. But I can say this, that there was a scandal at the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana. A scandal, a long-running scandal, had already broken for some time before I got there, because there was a professor there who was doing a secret research project that became known, and he admitted it. It was financed by the CIA, and it was research into the spread of AIDS in Africa. Now, why would the CIA be researching the spread of AIDS in Africa instead of a public health organization? Well, it has to do, I think, with attempts to predict or understand future political events in certain African countries that are hardest hit by AIDS. But it caused a scandal there, and this professor, nevertheless, was able to continue and terminate that project. But it was classified. It was research done at a university that the rest of the university could not see, neither in the making of the research or doing of the research, nor in the results. And that is one of the good arguments against having the CIA on the campuses, because of the secrecy involved in everything they do.
Thank you.
Speaking of drugs, I just might mention this. For many, many years, I've wondered whether it's possible that with all the U.S. military, Army, Navy, and Air Force, with the Coast Guard, with the Marine Corps, with the FBI, the DEA, the CIA, the State Department, the local and state police, the National Guard, whether it really is impossible to keep drugs out of the United States, heroin, cocaine particularly. And it seems to me that it would be possible if there was a desire. But I think that drug crisis in the United States is just like the other crises, that no matter how many times they say we're having a war on drugs, or how many times a new program is established to eliminate the drug culture, that in actual fact there is no desire really to change that. Why? Because of the effects. That drug crisis, or this drug crisis, is taking out of the political process millions, in fact generations, of young people who have everything to gain by fundamental change in the United States. And I'm talking about the millions of ghetto youths who, because of their background, ought to be political activists. They ought to be out there on the front lines of every political struggle in this country, but through consumption and through commerce in drugs, they are being taken out of the political process and neutralized. That is one effect anyway, and it is. Yes, sir.
This is about local CIA recruitment. There's a person named Jerry Daniels who was recruited out of the Forest Service as a smoke jumper, and he went to Vietnam, and about 3 years ago he died under mysterious circumstances. I don't know if you know anything about Jerry. If you did, I'd like to hear about it, because he was at that point trying to get out of the CIA and was studying the Yellow Rain in Southeast Asia at the time. And then they brought him back, closed casket, 7 CIA agents to guard his body. They wouldn't let any of his Hmong friends look at him. And these are people who've known him for years. So if you know anything about Jerry, I'm kind of curious.
No, I'm sorry I don't. But as I recall, that Yellow Rain, that was that chemical warfare, wasn't it, that turned out to be bead droppings or something in the end? At this microphone here.
My question is, how can we change the rules without opening ourselves up to more control from the incumbent power structure? What are our options?
Well, now you're putting me on the spot, because it's much easier to talk about the problems than the solutions. Well, I believe in electoral politics, you know, not exclusively in electoral politics, but I do believe in electoral politics. I think, for one thing, we ought to elect to the House of Representatives a lot more Ron Dellums, a lot more Bernie Sanders, for example, to the Senate more Paul Wellstones. There are good people in the, some good people in the House of Representatives and the Senate. They are few in number, but there are people out there who could be running for public office. And the idea of an additional political party is not a very strange one. There have been attempts before which have not been successful. But the National Organization of Women has been conducting a series of meetings around, a series of meetings around the country to determine whether or not to try to launch a political party. And all signs are that they are encouraged with what they found, and that this summer there's going to be a meeting, a national meeting of the of NOW, and they may very well announce that they will seek to form a political party. That's one way, for example. Mobilization of people is another. Outreach and getting people to join in whatever struggle it is, whether it's environment or whether it's gay lesbian rights or whether it is against the CIA recruiting on the campuses or whatever happens to be the issue. But keeping a coalition like you have here going is really very important. It's not going to happen tomorrow. And as I said, we live in the age of imperialism right now, and this is the imperialist country. It's going to be very hard to change. But after all, we used to think that the Soviet Union was an ironclad dictatorship. And if they can have glasnost and perestroika in their country, why can't we have it here in the United States? We'll find the ways, I'm sure.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Would you care to comment on the information which is coming out about the hostages for arms? Back when Reagan and Bush were getting ready to run for their first presidential candidacy.
Yes, as a matter of fact, I've been reading lately on that. I was reading a medical column that has to do with that. I heard that stress can cause atrial fibrillation. Did you know that? The story. The story has finally made it into the mainstream media in the United States. The story's been around for a long time, but thanks to Gary Sick and some others, it finally is in the mainstream media, that the Reagan-Bush team made a deal with the Iranians not to release the hostages before the 1980 elections, but to release them immediately upon Reagan-Bush taking office in the event that they were elected. I believe this from the first time I heard it. I believed it not because I know Bush so well, but because there is no other explanation for the fact that the Reagan-Bush administration began selling arms to the Iranians the minute they took office. They didn't start when this Iran-Contra affair started in 1980, what was it, 85? They didn't start then, or 84. They didn't start then. The first deliveries were within a couple of weeks after the inauguration in January 1980. There's no other reason than a deal to explain that, because Iran was an enemy of the United States. You don't sell arms to your enemy. What they had done with those 52 hostages, holding them 444 days, was an act of war. The United States had seized every asset of Iran that they could get their hands on all around the world. And there was going to be it still is, a long period of negotiation and recompense for what had happened. Why start selling them arms right away? What was Reagan's first security advisor's name, who is now trying to make this appear to be a false story? Richard Allen. I remember reading that on one of his news broadcasts or his interviews just before the election, the question came up of the U.S. school teacher who had been taken hostage in Iran some months before. She was not one of the original ones from the embassy, but she was being held hostage, and the Iranians apparently were talking about releasing, after the inauguration, all of those embassy hostages, but not this teacher. And Richard Allen let slip in this television commentary that if that teacher is not with all the other hostages, the deal is off. If you read about it, you find that. Well, what does Congress? Yes, what does Congress do? Congress does not want to get the real information, and in that, what passed for an investigation of Iran-Contra was nothing more than a cover-up. They set the beginning date of the information that they wanted to acquire as January 1st, 1985, I think, which set it far later than these earlier sales of arms to the Iranians. They did that precisely so they would not have to get information that would lead to a need to impeach Reagan and Bush. Why? Because they did not want to put into question the legitimacy of the entire public, that is the entire political system of the United States, like the Nixon-Watergate affair did. They could not afford to question the legitimacy of the political system and its corruption as happened in the 1970s. So what did they do? They simply covered up Iran-Contra. But Bush knows that there's a secret there. Did you read the context? Anybody read his words from the press conference yesterday when Webster resigned? Nobody read that? I can't believe it. Well, what Bush said when one of the reporters asked him about the October surprise, about the deal with the Iranians, Bush limited it to himself. He said he was not in Paris. He says, I never dealt personally, and I can only speak for myself. I mean, is he going to try to say he was out of the loop on this one? That story has got to stick to Bush, and everybody has got to make it stick to Bush like Watergate stuck to Nixon. He's got to be confronted with that story at every turn he makes. He cannot be allowed to slough off that story. It has to be kept in the public eye. But these words that he used yesterday in that press conference look awfully strange, really very strange, that he wouldn't out and out deny there was no deal. He wouldn't say that. He'd say, as far as I'm concerned, it's a dirty rumor, or something like that. But he would not say there was no deal. Well, we'll see what happens. Might be another case of atrial fibrillation down the road for him. Yes?
Yes, can you tell us something about possible or probable CIA involvement in the assassinations in this own country, the Kennedys, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, John Lennon?
Yes, yes. I'm glad to. You know, one of the best books on the Kennedy assassination, in fact, this is the best book that I found on the Jack Kennedy assassination. It's by Jim Garrison. It's called On the Trail of the Assassins. For those who don't know about Jim Garrison, I'd say very quickly that he was... Jim Garrison, at the time of the Kennedy assassination, was the district attorney in New Orleans. And he prosecuted the only criminal prosecution in the wake of the Kennedy assassination. He lost the case. But he was also one of the first people to raise doubts about the validity of the Warren Commission. This was the commission established by President Johnson under the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Earl Warren, to investigate Kennedy's assassination. They concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald had acted alone. It was the lone nut theory, and they discarded any possibility of a conspiracy. Well, Jim Garrison, in the 60s, raised the possibility that they were wrong, and he started pushing the conspiracy theory, that there were others involved besides Lee Harvey Oswald. For his trouble, Jim Garrison was crucified by the mainstream media in the 1960s. He was vilified. He was made to look a fool. Well, I have some friends in New York who are the editors of Covert Action Information Bulletin. And Ellen Ray, who was one of the editors, worked for Jim Garrison as a researcher in the 60s. And she finally, about 5 years ago, got Jim to write the book that he had been promising to write for many years. And the publishing house associated with the Covert Action Bulletin published the book, this one right here on the table. It reads like a detective story, and I bring it along because it shows the CIA involvement in Kennedy's assassination. It shows also rogue elements of the Secret Service, the Dallas police, and the Cuban exile community. They all had to be involved for the reasons he states.
What about Johnson?
Well, let me just finish on Kennedy because no indication that Johnson was involved in Kennedy's thing. No, none at all. But I mention that because despite what happened to Jim Garrison in the 1960s, he's now getting the last laugh. At this moment, Oliver Stone is filming his book in Dallas. It's going to be called JFK. It'll be in the theaters by late November or early December, so, according to what Stone says. That's his target date, and he'll probably make it. And Kevin Costner is playing Jim Garrison in the film. Sissy Spacek is playing Garrison's wife. Glenn Ford is in it. Jack Lemmon is in it. I think I heard that Brando is going to do a cameo for it. It's got a huge, huge cast. Enormous cast. But the last laugh is this. Jim Garrison himself is in the film as well. You know who he's playing? He's playing Earl Warren. Well, with the other Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, I really don't have, much to say about that. It looks like it was pretty clear. It was Sirhan. I mean, there were a lot of evidence. But there are people who get into these conspiracy theories, into the assassinations and can spend a whole life in that. And I meet them everywhere I go. I don't know that, and it's really something you can spend your entire life on, and I don't do that because it's just not my great interest. But surely, without a doubt, if you read this book here, you see that there was a conspiracy and that the Earl Warren Commission was really a cover-up. Over here this time, yes, that's right.
Two questions. Just for the ironic factor, the overthrow of the Prime Minister of Iran led rather directly to the Gulf crisis. An article in the Missoulian in January said that it was Norman Schwarzkopf, father, General Norman Schwarzkopf, working for the CIA that overthrew the Prime Minister of Iran. Can you confirm that? And then also, would you comment on April Glaspie's denial that what's been reported, you know, she waited 8 months to deny it, but now she's denied that she said the things that she said. Can you comment on that too?
Well, I comment first on April Glaspie. She's trying to rewrite history, that's all. There's no reason for them to have waited, for Tutwiler to have said it is essentially accurate back in October after the transcript was released. What they're doing is probably on the White House orders, Baker probably, telling her to do that because that is the weakest part of their whole case. The mainstream media is not raising the question of Bush's possibilities in stopping that invasion of Kuwait. And the mainstream media is going along with it too. You won't see in the New York Times or Washington Post or any mainstream newspapers people putting in the op-ed opinion that Bush needed that crisis, or that he encouraged the crisis, or that he could have stopped the crisis surely before it happened. It's just the opposite. Now the New York Times this morning is saying that in their commentary on Webster's resignation, they're saying that the CIA failed to predict the invasion, that Bush was caught by surprise by the invasion. I mean, really, that is so disgraceful for reporting. I mean, it would make any journalist ashamed to do that, because in the aftermath of that invasion, it was quite clearly shown that the CIA and the DIA had predicted the invasion. Well, the other part of the question on what was it?
Norman Schwarzkopf.
Oh, Schwarzkopf, yes. Oh, here's what happened on the overthrow of the Shah the overthrow of the Mossadegh government. In 1951, the Iranian government had nationalized the petroleum industry. Until then, since 1901, 50 years, it had been a British monopoly. The company was called Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, AIOC. It is the same company that later changed its name to British Petroleum, or BP, for those of you who know that company. The British were devastated with the nationalization of the petroleum, but they deserved it because they were paying the Iranians less in royalties than the company was paying the British government in taxes. And they were also selling the Iranians petroleum for internal consumption at the world market, and it was their petroleum. So they were giving the Iranians a pretty bad deal. And it was a nationalist issue, and when Mossadegh nationalized the petroleum in Iran in 1951, it was the biggest and greatest thing that had ever happened in Iran. Well, the British went to the CIA in late 1952, proposing that the CIA and the British organize jointly an operation to overthrow the government of Iran. That proposition was not taken up until Eisenhower came in January 1953. And the person who ran that operation was Teddy Roosevelt's grandson. His name was Kermit Roosevelt. He was one of those Eastern Blue Bloods who came out of the Ivy League into the CIA, as so many did in those early years. Kermit Roosevelt was the head of the CIA's Middle Eastern operations. And he overthrew that government of Iran. You won't believe it. It took him 19 days in August of 1953. He used 3 or 4 British agents. He used some clowns and weightlifters and wrestlers to start a mob march from the southern Tehran Bazaar area. It's all been written up in his book. Kermit Roosevelt wrote the book. He calls it Counter Coup. And one of the key factors